The afternoon sun poured through the tall glass windows of the airport terminal, casting warm light across rows of passengers waiting to board. David Carter sat quietly in the corner, his worn leather bag at his feet, his back straight as if the years of military discipline still shaped his posture. His eyes followed the movement of travelers, families hurrying with strollers, business people rushing with their phones pressed to their ears, and holidaymakers already smiling at the thought of their destinations. David had been waiting for this trip for months. His daughter, Claire, had invited him to visit her in Atlanta, and this time he had promised himself nothing would get in the way. Life had kept them apart too long, his military service, then his health, then her busy work schedule. Now, finally, there was time. Just the thought of her warm hug and the smell of her home-cooked meals made his heart light. When the boarding announcement came over the speakers, David stood, adjusted his jacket, and picked up his bag. He moved toward the gate at a steady pace, not rushing, not dragging his feet. A couple of people nodded to him as he passed, strangers who didn't know his name but seemed to sense his calm presence. The gate agents scanned tickets and welcomed passengers aboard. David waited patiently in line, his mind already halfway in Atlanta, imagining walking with Claire in her garden. When it was his turn, he handed over his boarding pass with a small smile. The gate agent scanned it and gestured toward the jet bridge. "Have a good flight, sir," she said. "Thank you," David replied in his deep, steady voice. The jet bridge was cool and quiet after the noise of the terminal. The hum of the aircraft grew louder as he approached the open door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of coffee and the clean scent of freshly wiped surfaces. The cabin was bright, with sunlight streaming in through oval windows on both sides. David stepped into the plane, and a young flight attendant by the door smiled warmly. "Welcome aboard," she said. He nodded politely, appreciating the small gesture. His seat was near the middle of the plane, a window seat he had chosen on purpose. He liked looking out at the clouds, losing himself in the vastness of the sky. He walked slowly down the aisle, careful not to bump anyone with his bag. Passengers were busy arranging their belongings, tucking jackets into overhead bins, and settling into their seats. The soft murmur of conversations filled the air. Some people barely looked up, but a few returned David's nod with a polite smile. As he reached his row, David paused. A mother and her young son were in the aisle seats. The boy looked up at him with wide eyes. "Are you a soldier?" the boy asked. Suddenly, David smiled gently. "I used to be a long time ago." The boy's eyes lit up. "That's cool." The mother gave David an apologetic smile, but he simply chuckled and placed his bag carefully in the overhead bin. Then he settled into his seat by the window, feeling the soft vibration of the engines as they prepared for takeoff. He took out a small book from his jacket pocket. It was an old paperback, the kind he liked to read on flights, but for a few moments he didn't open it. Instead, he gazed out the window at the airport runway, where ground crew in bright vests moved with practiced efficiency. The boarding process continued. People shuffled past his row, the overhead bins filling up quickly. He didn't mind the wait. Years in the service had taught him patience. He observed quietly the way some passengers moved as if late for an urgent meeting, while others strolled as though time had no hold over them. Somewhere behind him, a laugh rang out, clear and cheerful. Across the aisle, a man in a suit typed rapidly on his laptop. The variety of human lives all compressed into one small space always fascinated David. In a few minutes, they would all share the same journey, flying together far above the earth. The captain's voice came over the intercom, welcoming everyone and promising a smooth flight. David smiled faintly, imagining the view they'd soon have. Miles of clouds, the sunlight turning the world below into a patchwork of green and brown. A second flight attendant passed by, checking seat numbers and helping an elderly woman with her bag. Her tone was gentle, her patience obvious. David appreciated professionalism like that. It reminded him of the teamwork he valued so much in the military. The boy beside him tapped his mother's arm and whispered something, glancing at David. She nodded, and the boy turned again. "Do you still have your uniform?" he asked shyly. David chuckled. "I do. It's hanging in my closet." The boy grinned. "That's awesome. My dad says people like you are heroes." The words warmed David's heart. He didn't think of himself as a hero, just someone who had done his duty. But hearing it from a child somehow made it feel more real. The last few passengers boarded, the doors closed, and the cabin crew prepared for the safety demonstration. David buckled his seatbelt and glanced once more out the window. A small plane was taxiing nearby, its shadow moving across the tarmac like a quiet reminder of the world beyond this moment. He opened his book at last, but his mind was still partly on the journey ahead and partly on the people around him. He felt a rare sense of peace, until something unexpected caught his attention. From a few rows up, a voice cut through the cabin, sharp and impatient. A flight attendant was speaking, to someone just out of David's line of sight. The tone didn't match the calm, welcoming atmosphere from moments before. David's brow furrowed slightly, but he told himself it was probably a small misunderstanding. He turned a page in his book, trying to focus on the printed words. Still, the faint unease remained, a shadow at the edge of what had begun as a perfect day. In his heart, he didn't know that this flight, this very moment, would soon change the course of his life forever. David turned another page in his book, but the sharp voice ahead kept pulling his attention away from the words. He glanced up briefly, catching sight of the flight attendant with her back to him. She was speaking to a man about a bag in the overhead bin. Her tone was brisk, almost impatient. David shook his head lightly, thinking it was none of his business, and returned his gaze to the small block of text on the page. The moments passed, and the cabin settled again. The engines hummed gently, and the boy beside him whispered excitedly to his mother about flying through clouds. David gave them a polite smile and then leaned back into his seat. He was just finding his place in the story again when a shadow fell across his row. "Sir?" a voice said, sharp enough to pull his eyes upward. The same flight attendant now stood over him. Her name tag read Marla. She had a professional smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Yes?" David said politely. "Your bag," she began, glancing up toward the overhead bin. "Is it yours?" "Yes," David replied. "I placed it there before sitting down." Marla's smile thinned. "This bin is reserved for the passengers in the row directly under it. Your seat is in 14B, and that bin belongs to row 13. David blinked. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize there was a row-specific rule. I can move it if you'd like." Marla crossed her arms lightly. "It's important to follow our boarding procedures. It's printed on the safety card in the seat pocket." David nodded once. "Understood. I'll move it now." He stood up, lifted the bag, and placed it in the bin above his own row. It wasn't heavy, and the action took only a few seconds. When he sat back down, Marla was still standing there. "Next. Time," she said, her voice softer but still carrying a faint edge. "Please wait for instructions before putting your luggage anywhere." "I will," David said calmly. She gave a brief nod and moved on, but David could feel a shift in the air. The mother next to him glanced at him briefly, as if to ask silently if everything was all right. David gave her a small, reassuring smile, though he felt a strange heaviness in his chest. He had dealt with stricter situations in the military, orders barked under pressure, drills at dawn, discipline enforced with no room for argument. But there was something about the way Marla had spoken that left a faint sting, as though his good intentions hadn't mattered. The boy next to him, sensing the tension, leaned over. "That wasn't nice," he whispered. David chuckled softly. not wanting the child to dwell on it. "Sometimes people are just doing their job," he said. "It's best to stay patient." The safety demonstration began. The crew moved through the aisle with seatbelt instructions and oxygen mask explanations. Marla passed by again without meeting David's eyes. He followed the routine motions of buckling and unbuckling, storing his book in the seat pocket, and adjusting his seatbelt. When the demonstration ended, the captain announced the taxi toward the runway. The plane began to move, the vibration underfoot increasing. David closed his eyes briefly, letting the familiar hum of engines steady his thoughts. But just as the plane turned toward the runway, Marla's voice came again from beside him. "Sir, I also noticed you didn't check your carry-on size before boarding." David opened his eyes and looked at her, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "It fit in the overhead compartment," he said politely. She tilted her head. "Yes, but we have a measurement stand for a reason. I didn't see you use it. It's important for all passengers to follow the same rules." David's patience was still intact, but he felt an odd mix of confusion and discomfort. "I've traveled with this bag many times without an issue," he said. Marla's reply was swift. "Perhaps other flights overlooked it, but I make sure all guidelines are followed." David nodded slowly. "I appreciate your thoroughness." For a moment, they stared at each other, the hum of the engines filling the space between words. Then Marla turned away, moving toward the front of the cabin. David sat back again, glancing out the window. The ground crew outside was a blur of yellow vests and moving vehicles. He thought about the years he'd spent following rules far stricter than airline guidelines, and how rarely anyone had questioned his ability to comply. The plane lifted into the air moments later, the city shrinking below into a patchwork of rooftops and roads. The boy beside him pressed his face to the window, amazed by the sight. David smiled at his excitement, trying to set aside the earlier exchanges, but Marla's tone lingered in his mind. Not just what she said, but how she had said it. It was as if she was looking for mistakes instead of helping passengers feel welcome. As the seatbelt sign went off, the cabin came to life. People reached for headphones, books, and snacks. The flight attendants began moving drink carts down the aisle. When they reached David's row, Marla was the one serving. "What would you like to drink?" she asked, her voice polite but cool. "Just water, please," David said. She poured it, set it down, and moved on without another word. The mother beside him looked at him again, this time with a faint frown. "You've been very polite," she said softly, once Marla had gone. "I don't know why she's acting that way." David shook his head. "It's not worth dwelling on," he replied. But deep down, he wondered why small courtesies seemed to be missing from the interaction. The rest of the service went smoothly for the other rows, laughter and light conversation filling the space. David sipped his water and watched the clouds roll past, trying to keep his thoughts on his daughter's smiling face and the warm welcome that awaited him at the end of the flight. Still, the unease had taken root. He didn't know it yet, but this was only the first spark of something that would grow far beyond the quiet corners of this airplane cabin. The hum of the engines was steady, the view outside a sea of white clouds stretching to the horizon. David tried to lose himself in the calm of the sky, but something in the cabin felt different. The earlier unease still sat in the back of his mind like a shadow that wouldn't fade. The boy next to him had fallen asleep with his head against his mother's arm. She glanced down at her son, then gave David a polite smile. "He gets excited about planes," she whispered. David returned the smile. "It's a magical thing for a child," he said softly. The drink service had moved to the back of the cabin now, and the aisle was busy again. Passengers were stretching their legs, some standing near the restrooms, others reaching up for bags. David stayed in his seat, content to wait until the aisle cleared. He opened his book again, but before he could read a full page, Marla appeared in the aisle beside him. Her expression was tight, her tone brisk. Sir, she said, I need to speak with you. David looked up from his book. Of course. Is there a problem? Marla's eyes darted to the bag in the overhead bin above his row. Yes. I noticed you moved your bag earlier, but now another passenger is saying their things don't fit because of it. David closed the book gently and set it on his lap. My bag is above my own seat now, as you requested earlier. Is there an issue with space? There might be, Marla said, folding her arms. I'll need you to place it under the seat in front of you for the rest of the flight. David's brows lifted slightly. Under the seat? I don't believe it will fit there, and it would leave no room for my legs. The bag was fine in the overhead bin. Marla's voice lowered, but the firmness remained. I'm asking you to follow crew instructions, sir. Her words carried a finality that caught the attention of the mother beside him. She shifted uncomfortably, sensing tension building. David kept his tone measured. I understand, but I've followed every instruction you've given me. The bag is in the correct place now. Is there a specific reason it needs to be moved again? Marla's lips pressed together. You're questioning crew authority. That's not acceptable. David blinked at her, surprised. I'm only asking for clarification. I'm happy to follow rules, but I don't understand why this is necessary. Several passengers nearby had turned their heads, curiosity sparking in their eyes. The murmur of low conversations began. The cabin, moments ago filled with the quiet rustle of magazines and the hum of engines, now had a sharpness to it. Marla stepped back slightly, then turned toward the front of the cabin. Within a minute, she returned, this time with another crew member, a tall man with a calm expression. This is the passenger I was telling you about, Marla said to him. The man introduced himself as the lead flight attendant. Sir, we'd like to ask you to move your bag under the seat. It's our standard procedure when overhead bins are full. David nodded slowly. I respect that. But my bag was there before others boarded, and it's in the correct bin. I haven't broken any rules. I'm simply trying to keep my legs free for comfort during the flight. The lead attendant's voice stayed calm. I understand. But for now, we'd like you to comply so we can avoid any further disruption. David took a slow breath. He didn't want to cause trouble. He had never been the sort of man to make a scene. But the way Marla stood slightly behind the lead, attendant, arms crossed, made it clear this wasn't only about the bag anymore. All right, David said finally. If it helps keep the peace, I'll place it under the seat. He stood, retrieved the bag, and wedged it under the seat ahead. As expected, it pressed against his shoes, leaving little space for his legs. Thank you for your cooperation, the lead attendant said before walking away. Marla lingered for a moment, her gaze unreadable. Then she turned and followed him. David sat down again, the small victory of avoiding an argument overshadowed by a quiet frustration. He felt the mother beside him glance his way, and he offered a faint smile to reassure her. But the situation wasn't over. Less than 10 minutes later, Marla returned once more. Her voice was louder this time, and more passengers turned their heads. Sir, she said, I'm concerned about your attitude toward the crew. If you cannot follow instructions without questioning them, we may have to arrange for you to disembark when we land for safety reasons. David stared at her, shocked by the sudden escalation. I have followed every instruction you've given me, he said evenly. I've been polite, and I've not raised my voice. Her reply was curt. Politeness isn't the issue. Cooperation is. The mother beside him spoke up quietly but firmly. He has been nothing but cooperative. I've been sitting here the whole time. Marla's eyes flicked to her, then back to David. This is between the crew and the passenger, ma'am. David leaned back in his seat, choosing his words with care. I have no wish to cause any problems. I simply want to arrive at my destination without incident. Her expression remained firm, but after a moment she stepped away. The surrounding passengers exchanged quiet whispers, clearly aware that something unusual was unfolding. David's chest felt heavy. He thought of his daughter waiting for him, her excitement about their reunion. He had planned to tell her stories. From his service, share laughs over dinner, and enjoy the simple peace of being together. Now there was a small, growing worry in his mind that this flight might not end as expected. The rest of the cabin returned slowly to its previous rhythm, but David could feel eyes on him from time to time. He returned to his book, though the words on the page swam slightly. His mind replayed the exchanges, searching for where things had gone wrong. By the time the plane began its gradual descent, the tension had settled into a quiet stillness, like the moment before a storm finally breaks. David didn't know it yet, but the real confrontation was still ahead, waiting just beyond the runway. The wheels touched the runway with a soft bump, and the plane rolled forward, slowing as the engines hummed in reverse thrust. David felt the familiar weight in his chest, the mix of relief at landing and anticipation of finally seeing his daughter. Outside the window, the airport ground crew moved in small, quick steps, guiding the aircraft toward the gate. The captain's calm voice came over the intercom. "Welcome to Charlotte for our short layover before continuing to Atlanta. Please, remain seated until the seatbelt sign is switched off." David closed his book and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He glanced toward the front of the cabin. Marla was standing near the door, speaking in a low voice to the lead flight attendant. Their faces were unreadable, but the occasional sideways glance toward David made it clear they were discussing him. The seatbelt sign went off, and passengers began unbuckling, stretching, and reaching for the overhead bins. David remained seated, preferring to let the rush pass before he stood. Then Marla's voice came, louder than necessary, cutting through the chatter. "Mr. Carter," she called. David looked up. "Yes?" Her tone was clipped, businesslike. "Before we allow the next group of passengers to board for Atlanta, I need you to collect your belongings and step off the plane." The words hit him like a cold wave. Around him, passengers froze mid-motion, their eyes darting between David and the attendant. The mother beside him frowned deeply. "Is there a problem?" she asked. "This is between the airline and the passenger," Marla replied quickly, not breaking her gaze from David. David felt every set of eyes on him now. His first instinct was to demand an explanation, but years of training had taught him restraint. Instead, he spoke calmly. "May I ask why?" "For safety reasons," Marla said. "You've displayed behavior the crew feels is uncooperative. We'll be arranging for you to speak with ground staff." David's stomach tightened, not from fear but from the sharp sting of humiliation. "I've followed every instruction given to me," he said quietly. Her reply was final. "Sir, please gather your things." The boy beside him had woken up and was looking at David with wide, confused eyes. "Are you in trouble?" he asked softly. David forced a small smile. "No, buddy. Just a misunderstanding." He stood, the motion slow, deliberate. He reached up to take his bag from the overhead bin, feeling the weight of silence around him. Even the usual shuffle of passengers exiting had stopped. The air felt thick. The mother spoke again, this time louder. "He's done nothing wrong. I've been here the whole time." Marla didn't respond. She stepped aside, giving David space to walk down the aisle. David gripped his bag and started forward. The aisle felt narrower than before, every step magnified by the quiet of the cabin. Passengers leaned slightly into the aisle, watching him pass. Some wore expressions of sympathy, others of curiosity. A few lifted their phones discreetly, recording the scene. He kept his head high, his gaze forward. Years in uniform had taught him that dignity was not in how the world treated you, but in how you carried yourself when it mattered most. Halfway down, an older man in a business suit leaned out slightly and murmured, "Stay strong, sir." David nodded in acknowledgement, not trusting himself to speak. The walk felt longer than it should have. Each row passed like a slow parade of judgment. At the front, the lead flight attendant stepped aside to let him exit. "Ground staff will meet you just outside," he said in a neutral tone. David gave a short nod and stepped into the jet bridge. The air here was cooler, quieter. The hum of the cabin faded behind him, replaced by the distant echo of airport announcements. A uniformed gate agent waited near the door. She looked at him with a mix of professionalism and discomfort, as if she had been briefed but wasn't sure how to feel about it. "Mr. Carter?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "Please come with me." They walked together toward the terminal. David could feel his pulse in his ears. Every step away from the plane felt like another layer of separation from the reunion he'd been looking forward to. When they reached a quiet corner near the gate desk, the agent gestured for him to wait. "Someone from the airline's customer service team will be here shortly to speak with you." David set his bag down beside his chair and sat, hands resting loosely in his lap. From here, he could see the plane through the glass, passengers moving about inside as if nothing unusual had happened. He thought of his daughter again, how she'd be checking the time, expecting his arrival. He imagined the call he might have to make to explain why he wouldn't be on the next flight. The thought made his jaw tighten. Minutes passed. Passengers from the earlier flight began to trickle into the terminal, some glancing his way. A couple of them gave him small nods of acknowledgement as though silently agreeing that they'd witnessed something unfair. The mother from his row approached briefly, her son holding her hand. "I'm sorry for what happened," she said softly. "You didn't deserve that." David's voice was steady. "Thank you. I'll be all right." She squeezed his arm gently before walking away. Eventually, a man in a crisp navy blazer arrived, introducing himself as the airline's duty manager. "Mr. Carter, I understand there was an incident on board. The crew reported concerns about your cooperation with their instructions." David met his eyes. "I followed every instruction given to me. I've traveled often, and I know how important it is to respect the crew. I never raised my voice, and I certainly didn't cause any disruption." The manager nodded slowly, making notes on a small tablet. "We'll review the reports and the footage from the cabin cameras. For now, I'm afraid we won't be able to continue your journey on this flight." David absorbed the words quietly. "So I'm being left here without reaching my destination?" The manager hesitated. "We'll rebook you on another flight later today, but it may take several hours." David picked up his bag. "Then I'll wait." His voice was calm, but inside a quiet storm had begun to build. Not of anger, but of resolve. Something about the way this had unfolded felt wrong, and he knew he couldn't simply walk away from it. He looked once more through the terminal window at the plane. Passengers were settling again for the next leg of the journey, the cabin door closing. The boy from his row pressed his face to the glass for a moment, waving in David's direction. David lifted a hand in return, a small gesture that carried more weight than it seemed. He didn't know it yet, but that short, heavy walk down the aisle had just been recorded on several phones, and those videos were about to travel far beyond this airport. David sat in the quiet corner of the terminal, his bag beside him, watching people move in every direction. The voices over the loudspeakers announced boarding for other flights, each one reminding him of the journey he wasn't on. The seat felt harder the longer he stayed there, but he didn't shift. He kept his posture straight, his thoughts steady, even as a dull ache formed in his chest. He pulled out his phone to check the time. Claire would be waiting for his call soon, wondering why he hadn't landed in Atlanta. He debated telling her everything right away, but decided to wait until he knew the airline's final decision. He didn't want her to worry before he had something certain to say. Around him, passengers from his earlier flight began to leave the terminal area. Some walked past without looking. Others sent him quick, sympathetic glances. He noticed, too, Young men paused nearby, whispering and looking at their phones. One of them, wearing a baseball cap, finally stepped closer. "Sir," the young man said quietly, "I recorded what happened on the plane. The way they treated you, it didn't seem right." David looked at him, surprised. "You recorded it?" The young man nodded. "Yeah, I wasn't the only one either. People are already sharing it online. My sister's in a veterans group and she posted it there. Folks are angry." David hesitated, unsure what to say. "I appreciate that," he said finally. "But my goal isn't to make trouble. I just wanted to get to my daughter." The man's friend spoke up. "Sometimes trouble finds us whether we want it or not. People need to see how passengers can be treated." They gave him a respectful nod and left, their phones still in hand. David leaned back in his chair. He wasn't much for social media. He preferred face-to-face conversations, but he knew things moved fast in the online world. Still, he didn't expect what would happen next. About 20 minutes later, his phone buzzed. It was Claire calling. "Dad, are you okay?" Her voice carried both concern and urgency. "I'm fine," David said calmly. "I just won't be on the flight we planned. There was a disagreement with a crew member. They asked me to leave the plane." There was a pause, then Claire's tone sharpened. "Is this what I'm seeing online? There's a video of you walking down the aisle and people are saying you were unfairly removed. It's all over my feed." David sighed softly. "I guess word travels fast." "Fast?" she said. "Dad, it's already got thousands of views. People are tagging news stations. Veteran groups are talking about it. Some folks are saying they'll boycott the airline." He was silent for a moment, letting the information settle. The thought of strangers standing up for him was unexpected, and a small warmth grew in his chest. Claire continued, her voice softening. "I know you don't like the spotlight, but maybe this is one of those moments when you shouldn't stay quiet." Before he could answer, another call came in. It was from a number he didn't recognize. Claire told him to pick it up. It might be important. So he switched lines. "Mr. Carter," a deep, steady voice said, "this is Colonel Harris. You might not remember me, but I served under your command back in 2004. David's mind flashed. Back to long, hot days overseas, the faces of his unit, and the quiet moments between missions. "Of course I remember, Colonel. How are you?" "I'm fine," Harris said. "But I just saw that video. Sir, I can't stand by while someone who gave so much for this country is treated that way. I've already spoken with a few people. I know in the media and business circles, they want to talk to you, give you a platform to tell your side of the story." David rubbed the back of his neck. "I'm not looking for fame or trouble, Harris." "I know," Harris replied. "But this isn't about fame. It's about respect, and making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." They spoke for a few more minutes before ending the call. David sat still, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Within the hour, 2 reporters from local news stations arrived at the terminal. They had seen the circulating video and wanted to interview him. David was hesitant, but after a brief call with Claire, who encouraged him to speak, he agreed. The cameras rolled as he told the story plainly. No embellishments, no raised voice, just the simple truth of what happened. He explained how he had followed instructions, how he had kept calm, and how it still led to him being removed from the flight. The interview was short, but it spread quickly online. Messages began pouring in, old friends from the service, strangers offering support, advocacy groups reaching out. One message in particular stood out. It came from a well-known entrepreneur, a man who had built several successful companies and was also a veteran. The message was simple. "Call me. I think we can turn this into something bigger than you imagine." David stared at the phone for a long moment. He didn't know exactly what the man meant, but something in his gut told him this was the start of a path he hadn't planned to walk. The duty manager eventually returned, offering David a seat on a later flight to Atlanta. He accepted. It would get him to Claire, after all, but his mind was no longer on just the trip ahead. As he boarded the new plane that evening, the atmosphere felt different. The crew greeted him warmly, and a couple of passengers recognized him from the video, offering quiet words of encouragement. He settled into his seat, looking out at the runway lights. The events of the day had been exhausting, but they had also lit a spark in him. Somewhere in the back of his mind, an idea was beginning to take shape, an idea about dignity, respect, and creating something that would ensure no passenger felt the way he had that afternoon. David didn't know how it would happen yet, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the story. The night after David arrived in Atlanta, he sat at Claire's kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of him. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Claire sat across from him, her laptop open, scanning the latest news articles. "Dad," she said, turning the screen toward him, "look at this. The video's everywhere now. It's on national news sites. People are talking about it on TV." David looked at the headlines. Words like veteran removed from flight and public outrage against Airline stood out in bold letters. Pictures of him walking down the airplane aisle filled the screen, alongside short clips of him speaking to reporters. "I didn't expect all this," he admitted. "I thought it would just be a few people talking online." Claire smiled softly. "Sometimes the right story at the right time can move people. You didn't shout or argue, you just told the truth. People respect that." Before David could reply, his phone buzzed. It was the number from the entrepreneur who had messaged him earlier. He hesitated, then answered. "Mr. Carter," the voice said warmly, "this is Michael Grant. I saw what happened to you, and I think you have a bigger role to play than you realize." David leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Grant, I'm grateful for your message, but I'm not sure what you mean." Michael's voice was calm and confident. "I own several businesses, including a small regional airline. I built them from the ground up. When I saw how you were treated, I thought, this man understands dignity and discipline. You could help me build something better, something that changes the way people think about air travel." David chuckled lightly. "I've never run an airline before." "You've led people in tougher situations," Michael replied. "And I'm not talking about you doing it alone. I'm talking about a partnership. I have the resources, but I need a public face, a leader people trust. Your story has already reached millions. If we move now, we can use this moment to build something people believe in." The conversation lasted over an hour. Michael explained that he had been planning to expand his airline for years, but needed a cause and a message that would set it apart. With David's name and reputation, they could attract investors, staff, and passengers who wanted a respectful and fair travel experience. When the call ended, David sat quietly for a while. Claire watched him carefully. "What are you thinking, Dad?" "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that maybe this wasn't just about me being mistreated. Maybe it's about what can come after." The next day, David and Claire flew to New York to meet Michael in person. Michael was a tall man in his early 50s with sharp eyes but a warm smile. He greeted David with a firm handshake and a promise. "We're going to make something great, and we're going to make it the right way." Over the next several days, they sat in long meetings. They discussed what the airline would stand for: safety, fairness, and customer dignity. David insisted on one thing above all. No passenger should ever feel powerless in the face of the crew. Respect should go both ways. Michael agreed. He even suggested naming the airline after something that would reflect David's values. They settled on the name Liberty Wings. Meanwhile, the public continued to rally behind David. Veteran groups pledged to support Liberty Wings when it launched. Social media was flooded with messages from people saying they would switch airlines to stand with him. Michael moved quickly. He brought in his team of lawyers, accountants, and aviation experts. Contracts were signed, investments secured, and within a month, David found himself as the co-owner and public ambassador of Liberty Wings. One afternoon, as they toured a hangar full of planes being prepared for the relaunch, Michael turned to David and said, "When we go public with this, we're not just announcing a new airline. We're announcing a new standard." David nodded. "Then let's make sure we live up to it." They planned the official press conference for the following week. Invitations went out to major news outlets, veteran organizations, and even some of the passengers who had been on David's original flight. On the morning of the event, David stood backstage, adjusting his tie. Claire was there, giving him a reassuring smile. "You've been through harder days than this," she reminded him. When it was his turn to speak, David stepped up to the podium. The room was filled with cameras and reporters, their lenses pointed straight at him. He took a deep breath. "Good morning," he began. "A few weeks ago, I was removed from a flight for reasons that still don't make sense to me. But this is not a speech about what went wrong. This is about what we can make right." He spoke about his years in the military, about the importance of respect, and about how small acts of kindness could change lives. Then he introduced Liberty Wings, explaining its mission and the promise it would make to every passenger, to treat them as valued guests, not just ticket numbers. By the time he finished, the room erupted in applause. Cameras flashed and questions flew. Michael joined him on stage, shaking his hand firmly for the world to see. That night, news channels across the country covered the story. Headlines read, "Veteran turns disrespect into opportunity, launches airline with a mission." David sat in his hotel room, watching the coverage with Claire. "Feels strange," he admitted. "One moment, you're walking off a plane wondering what went wrong. The next, you're here, planning flights of your own." Claire smiled. "Maybe that's life, Dad. One closed door, and sometimes an entire runway opens up." David laughed softly at her words. He didn't know exactly what challenges lay ahead for Liberty Wings, but he felt ready for them. Somewhere in the distance, planes took off into the night sky. And for the first time since that difficult day at the airport, David felt not just like a passenger in life, but like a pilot of his own destiny. 6 months after Liberty Wings was launched, the airline was already making headlines. Customers praised its respectful service, comfortable seating, and honest prices. Many travelers said it felt like flying in a different era, when people cared about passengers, not just profits. David had spent those months traveling between cities, meeting with staff, greeting passengers, and personally ensuring that the company's values were followed. He wasn't just a name on the board of directors. He was present, shaking hands and listening to feedback. One chilly autumn morning, David was in his office at Liberty Wings headquarters going through reports. Claire entered with a spark in her eyes. "Dad, you won't believe this," she said, handing him her tablet. "Look at these numbers." David scrolled through the report. Liberty Wings had just passed the old airline, the very one that had removed him from that flight, in customer satisfaction rankings. A small smile spread across David's face. "We're doing something right," Claire grinned. "Not just something right. We're beating them at their own game." A few weeks later, an industry conference was held in Dallas. All major airline CEOs and executives were invited to speak, including David. It was the first time he would be in the same room as the executives from the airline that had humiliated him. When David arrived at the Grand Hall, cameras followed him. Reporters whispered, eager to capture the moment. The conference began with various airline leaders talking about fuel costs, new routes, and technology upgrades. Then it was the turn of the old airline's CEO, Mr. Richards. He walked up to the podium with forced confidence. "Our company," Mr. Richards said, "has been a leader in air travel for decades. Despite recent challenges, we remain committed to excellence." David could feel the tension in the room. Everyone knew those recent challenges referred to the scandal involving him. Finally, David's name was announced. The applause was louder than he expected. He stepped up to the microphone, took a breath, and began. 6 months ago, I was removed from a flight. I could have stayed bitter, but instead, I decided to build something better. Liberty Wings was born from that moment, not out of anger, but out of hope for a better travel experience. He spoke about treating passengers with dignity, about listening to feedback, and about creating jobs where employees felt respected. His words were calm, but they carried weight. When he finished, the audience rose to their feet in applause. Even some of the old airline's employees joined in. Later that day, as David walked through the lobby, Mr. Richards approached him. "Carter," he said stiffly, "you've made quite a name for yourself, but don't think this industry is easy. It can turn on you fast." David looked at him calmly. "I've been through worse storms than this, Richards. The difference is I'm not here to win a fight. I'm here to change the way people feel when they fly." Mr. Richards gave a thin smile and walked away. The turning point came just 2 months later. Liberty Wings secured a major government contract to provide charter flights for military personnel and their families. The old airline had held that contract for over a decade, but they lost it due to poor service ratings. When the news broke, it spread like wildfire. Veterans organizations praised Liberty Wings for hiring many former service members as pilots, mechanics, and crew. Social media lit up with posts like, "From being kicked off a plane to running the best airline in the country, David Carter's story is legendary." Business boomed. Liberty Wings expanded to more cities, bought additional planes, and even opened a training academy for young pilots who couldn't afford traditional flight school. One sunny morning, David found himself back at the same airport where everything had started. He was there to welcome the first Liberty Wings flight on a new route. As he walked through the terminal, an elderly man in a veteran's cap stopped him. "Sir, I just want to say thank you," the man said. "I flew with Liberty Wings last week. Best flight I've had in 20 years. Your crew treated me like family." David shook his hand warmly. "That means more to me than you know." Nearby, a group of reporters spotted him and hurried over. One of them asked, "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to not only recover from what happened, but to be more successful than the airline that wronged you?" David thought for a moment before answering. "It feels peaceful, because success isn't just about beating someone. It's about proving that there's a better way." That afternoon, David boarded a Liberty Wings plane bound for Washington, D.C., where he would meet with government officials about expanding the airline's veteran programs. As he stepped onto the aircraft, the flight attendant greeted him with a smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter. We're honored to have you." He nodded, taking his seat. As the plane taxied down the runway, he looked out the window at the busy airport. Somewhere out there, the old airline still flew its planes, but their dominance was fading. When the engines roared and the plane lifted into the sky, David felt a deep sense of closure. The humiliation he once felt was gone, replaced by pride, not just in what he had built, but in the fact that he had stayed true to his principles along the way. Months later, Liberty Wings hosted a celebration for its 1-year anniversary. Employees from every department gathered in a large hangar decorated with banners and lights. Families came, music played, and the smell of fresh barbecue filled the air. David took the stage to address the crowd. "1 year ago, I had no idea. This is where I'd be today. But every one of you, pilots, crew, mechanics, support staff, you made this possible. We proved that kindness, fairness, and respect can be the foundation of success." The crowd erupted in cheers. Claire stood in the front row, clapping proudly. As David looked over the smiling faces, he realized that the airline was more than just planes and routes. It was a community built on trust, and in that moment he knew that no insult, no act of disrespect, could ever take away what they had achieved together. The journey had started with pain, but it had taken flight on the wings of dignity, and those wings would carry them far into the future.